Chapter 11. Baby, I'm an anarchist.
You believe in authority? I believe in myself.
It was pitch black outside when Izuku rose for the day. Not that it made much of a difference, he'd barely slept anyways. Izuku's excitement had been building up all week, the hours at work dragging by more and more slowly as the weekend approached. Izuku practically leapt out bed when his alarm finally went off. He buzzed with excitement, moving through his routine expediently. Sitting in his desk chair, Izuku snapped his telephoto lens into his Nikon. He held the camera up to his face and grinned. This was it, his first assignment as a photojournalist. Today, he was going to make a name for himself. He'd take the best photos of his life, send them to the major news outlets and bring attention to an important issue. Even Katsuki would have no choice but to be impressed. Izuku's grin wavered. The anti-heroes had left on tour nearly 2 weeks ago. Izuku tried to not let it bother him that Katsuki hadn't messaged him once. Izuku had sent a text a few days in, but after receiving no response, he'd left it alone. Katsuki was probably focused on the tour right now. He was too busy to chat. Izuku wouldn't let himself wallow in anxious thoughts. He had more important things to worry about. Over the past couple of weeks, Izuku had kept himself busy. Besides preparing for his assignment, he'd managed to finish touching up Okako's photographs and had begun pulling content together for his website. His social media presence was growing steadily as he continued to post concert photographs and finals from his photo shoots. Izuku's confidence in his abilities was at an all-time high. Izuku shrugged into his plain winter coat and slipped on an old pair of gloves that he'd cut the fingertips off of for dexterity. He flexed his fingers, then picked up his camera, wrapping the strap around his neck. Izuku evaluated his appearance in the mirror. He brought his camera to his face and beamed at his reflection. He felt like the real deal, and he snapped a photo to commemorate the occasion. New year, new Izuku, he murmured as he tucked his Nikon carefully into his camera bag. He nodded resolutely, then pulled on his heavy boots. Izuku strode out of his apartment with the air of a man ready to take on the world. The sun was beginning to come up over the city when Izuku reached the downtrodden public square that he and his contact had agreed to meet at. The place was deserted save a couple of homeless men wrapped up in sleeping bags and a small group of people that were huddled by a street corner. A substantial number of white plastic buckets were stacked beside them. Izuku approached the group cautiously. One of its members caught his eye well before he reached them and nudged another in the group. One by one, the group turned to look at him. It was unnerving, but Izuku kept moving. He tried for a friendly smile. A tall blonde man with piercing grey eyes glanced Izuku over. His eyes darted to Izuku's camera bag. Monoma?" Izuku asked uncertainly. The man was decked out in odd attire. He wore no coat despite the cold, opting for a formal suit instead. His hair was slicked back from his face and a pocket watch hung from one of his belt loops. The group's gazes turned towards the blonde expectantly. "Midoriya Izuku," the man said. Izuku nodded anxiously, patting his camera bag as if to re-establish himself. "That's me." The blonde's face rearranged itself into an approving smile. "Good, good," he said. He gestured with a gentlemanly air to the group. "Everyone, this is our photographer. He's going to make us all famous. Treat him well." The group's eyes returned to Izuku, less wary and more curious. "He's our guy. The one who photographs for the anti-heroes." "The who?" "You know. That one band. He looks scared." "How cute." Izuku said. "It's nice to meet you all." "Now," Monoma said, clapping his hands together. "I believe our plans have been made clear." The group murmured affirmations. "Then it's off to your stations. Be sure to direct your subjects properly. We strike at 10. Now go, before we draw too much attention." The group let up a cheer, raising clenched fists, then split off in different directions. A woman in a black corset laced over top of a Halloween store Victorian gown stayed behind, her long red hair twisted into a loose updo. As the group drifted apart, Izuku glanced at the covered containers. "What's in the buckets?" he asked curiously. Monoma grinned, his eyes a little too wide. "Want one?" he asked. Izuku looked at Monoma warily. "I think I'll have my hands full with my camera, thanks," he replied. "Good man." Monoma smirked. "The a-holes have been keeping everything quiet for weeks. Our plan is to throw a little chaos into their lives, but we'll need you to help spread the word." Izuku's heart pounded with a sudden sense of self-importance. "You can count on me," he said. "I hope so," Monoma replied. He cracked his knuckles, his voice slowly growing louder. "This is how it all begins. The cops and the media start covering up for each other and preventing the spread of information. When you control the flow, you control the people. How scary! Before long, we'll find ourselves trapped in a police state and it will be too late to do anything, much too late. The only option left will be civil warfare and..." "Nyato," the woman in the corset said suddenly. She karate chopped Monoma on the back of the head. "If you start acting crazy, no one will want to join our cause." Monoma scowled and rubbed his head. The woman smiled at Izuku kindly. "Sorry about him," she said. "He can get a bit, you know." "Ah, that's all right." Izuku replied quickly. He took a step back and averted his eyes. "She was awfully pretty. I guess you need to be an intense person in order to plan an event like this, right?" The woman's eyes danced. "You're not wrong," she said. Monoma's expression was sullen. "Midoriya," he said begrudgingly. "This is my partner in crime, Kendo Itsuka. I basically keep this idiot in check," Kendo said. She patted Monoma's shoulder. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" Monoma asked reproachfully. "I do," Kendo replied without missing a beat. She curtsied towards Izuku. He thought her legs must be very cold. "It was nice to meet you, Midoriya," she said. She shot a look at Monoma. "Let's do this right. I mean it." Monoma waved a hand towards Kendo dismissively. "I know," he said. "I'll see you soon." Kendo sighed. She turned on her heel and flounced away, shaking her head. "Midoriya, you stay with me," Monoma instructed. "We've got work to do." People slowly filtered through the square over the next hour or so. Some approached to receive instruction and, occasionally, a bucket. Izuku and Monoma received strange looks from several passers-by, but most people ignored them completely. Attempts at conversation were stilted at best. Izuku quickly learned through their back and forth that Monoma wasn't exactly the most pleasant person to talk to. Eventually Izuku began to make a mental game of figuring out whether or not someone who passed through the area was affiliated with the protest. He'd accurately identified a number of protesters sporting unusual haircuts and clothing, but there were also quite a few who didn't look or dress much differently from Izuku himself. Some people were wearing masks or had otherwise obscured their faces. Izuku spotted more than one person wearing apparel emblazoned with a large surrounded by a circle. The strangest thing that he saw was a man dressed from head to toe in a Deadpool bodysuit. Izuku learned that Monoma had been coordinating protests within the city for a number of years. To detract attention from the event, he had stationed his support team at various locations, sending groups of participants this way and that. The plan was to rally together in front of the police station and catch the division off guard. Izuku had to admit that it was a pretty clever strategy. Soon there was only a single bucket left. "Well," Monoma said, glancing at his pocket watch. "It's about that time. Shall we?" "Yes," Izuku said, his fingertips itching. Monoma bent down to pick up the final bucket. Izuku noticed that the back of his suit was painted and the phrase revolt/action/insurrection could be read clearly. Izuku snapped a quick picture. He shuffled his feet restlessly. Monoma straightened and eyed Izuku with a flicker of amusement. "You know," he said as he turned to leave the square, "when you first said that Ground Zero had sent you my way, I admit I was wary. I'm glad that the people he recommends can at least follow through on their commitments." Izuku was quick to reply. "Ka-chan said that he'd planned on going, but you'd changed the date. They've been away on tour for a couple of weeks now." Monoma's eyes slid towards Izuku. "Ka-chan?" he asked. Izuku flushed. "Sorry," he said. "I meant Ground Zero." "How droll," Monoma drawled. "You must be close." It's not," Izuku trailed off. There wasn't any way he could explain the origin of that nickname that didn't sound strange. Never mind. Monoma smirked. Izuku wasn't sure he liked the knowing glint in Monoma's eye. As they walked, the buildings became more and more dilapidated. There were some obvious attempts at gentrification here and there, but the majority of the area was riddled with pawn shops, fast food chains and low-income housing. The police station was situated on a main road. It was an older brick and mortar building, a smaller station than those in the city core. Of the documented incidents that had occurred in the past months, nearly all had involved officers from this station. Izuku became anxious as they drew closer. He could see protesters beginning to gather outside, many wielding placards and some holding buckets. He didn't know exactly what Monoma was planning, but he intended to capture it as best he could. He wasn't doing anything wrong by being here, he reminded himself. This was what photojournalists did. This was exactly what he had to do if he wanted to force his way into the field. He couldn't always play it safe. Monoma checked his pocket watch. 5 minutes, he murmured. Izuku readied his camera. It was amazing to see the number of people coming out of the woodworks. Protesters quickly spilled over the sidewalk and onto the streets. More signs were raised. Izuku let Monoma go on ahead. He stopped to take a photograph of someone who was wielding a sign that read "To protect and serve who?" Everything came together very quickly. In a matter of minutes, the streets were clogged with protesters, stopping traffic in both directions. Many drivers honked angrily, but some seemed curious. Izuku watched a woman get out of her car and let out a whoop of solidarity. There had to be well over 100 people, and more were coming. "Dearest friends!" Monoma's voice boomed from a megaphone. Kendo stood nearby, holding a megaphone of her own. "We are here today because a grave injustice has been committed against the people of this city." Protesters shouted and waved their placards. Izuku moved through the crowd, adjusting his position in order to find the best angle. He'd gotten used to working around large groups of people at concerts and he was glad for it. His hands trembled with anticipation as he watched Monoma rile up the crowd through the lens of his camera. The officers at this station have abused their power for far too long. Today is the day we take a stand. We are the citizens, and if the system does not work for us, then the system does not work. The shouting intensified. Pockets of people began chanting while others hollered words of support. Kendo handed her megaphone to a young woman with dark hair who stood beside her. She couldn't have been older than 20. "My brother was battered by 2 officers at this station," she said into the megaphone, her voice wavering. Kendo put a hand on her shoulder. "He's still in the hospital. He barely made it out alive. These holes think they can get away with anything. Well, they're effing wrong. No more spilled blood." The crowd began stomping their feet. Some drummed on the lids of their buckets. "No more spilled blood," they chanted. The woman's somber expression transformed into a grin. She repeated the chant into the megaphone, and Monoma and Kendo did the same. Izuku snapped a photograph of the 3 of them in mid-shout that made him proud. The chant increased in volume, the stomping and drumming drowning out all other street noise. The vibration was intense. There was so much to take in, but Izuku couldn't waver. A number of armed officers began to pour out from one side of the building. They shouted at the protesters while other officers barred the station doors from the inside. Izuku saw Monoma mutter something to Kendo. She nodded. The chant continued as Monoma passed his megaphone to Kendo. He pried the lid off the top of his bucket. Izuku could see a thick red liquid sloshing heavily inside of it. Those in the crowd who had their own buckets pressed forward. "No more spilled blood." Kendo's voice rang out over the crowd. She kept the chant going strong while Monoma surged towards the station. It happened in a matter of seconds. Monoma hoisted his bucket back, then flung it forwards, splattering the bright red contents against the station doors. Izuku leapt into action. He ran towards the station, fanning out to achieve a better viewpoint. The protesters bolted forwards en masse and began to throw the contents of their buckets against the station's front. Red liquid flew through the air, quickly coating the atmosphere with its distinctive smell. Paint? They were throwing red paint at the building. Izuku didn't have time to process, he only had time to document. He worked furiously, catching several protesters mid-throw. Red paint hovered in the air on his camera, milliseconds away from hitting the building. Izuku didn't have time to review his work. He moved like a madman, desperately trying to keep up with it all. Protesters shouted as bucket after bucket of paint coated the windows and bricks, ricochet spattering their faces and hands. A part of Izuku was terrified. The protesters that he'd come with were vandalizing a police station. He'd never been involved with anything illegal in his entire life. Another part of Izuku was exhilarated. He couldn't have pried the stupid grin off his face no matter how hard he tried. This was it. This was what he was meant to be doing. Once the protest had ended, Izuku would market his photographs to the news outlets he'd researched. With any luck, his work would be published within 24 hours. For the first time since graduating, Izuku felt fulfilled. The police officers approached the crowd, barking orders. The protesters continued to throw paint. The thick fluid ran down the walls and began to pool on the ground around the station. "Back, all of you," an officer shouted, her face contorted in a rage she was clearly struggling to suppress. A number of them made their way between the protesters and the building, each equipped with visible weapons. One of the officers pulled out a can of mace. The protesters backed up, but they continued to chant, stomping their feet on the ground while others jeered. More officers poured from the building, now sporting riot gear. They advanced while the prior officers expanded outwards onto the streets, letting the shielded cops take the lead. It was at this time that one of the officers spotted Izuku. "Hey, you," the cop shouted, stalking over. Izuku's blood ran cold. He straightened himself on pure instinct, gripping his camera tightly between his hands. The officer planted himself firmly in front of Izuku. He loomed over him, one hand on his belt. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Izuku's heart leapt to his throat, but he forced himself to think. I'm a photojournalist," he said. The words gave him a sudden boost of confidence. He met the officer with an even gaze. "I'm documenting this event." "Oh, really?" the officer said. He sounded skeptical. "What agency are you with?" The officer's body language was clearly designed to intimidate. It wasn't entirely unlike that of someone else Izuku knew. He could do this. "I'm a freelancer," Izuku replied. "Sure," the officer said, his hand still hovering over his belt. "Why don't you get the hell out of here, kid?" Izuku stood his ground. "I'm only here to document," he repeated. "I'm within my rights." The officer's face reddened. He flicked his holster open. "You have exactly 1 minute to clear the area before I have you arrested and confiscate your camera," he snapped. Izuku's hands tightened around his camera. He swallowed his rising panic. "Focus," he thought. Izuku offered a wobbly smile to the officer. "Are you threatening me, sir?" he asked loudly. Before the officer could respond, Monoma materialized beside Izuku. He grabbed Izuku's shoulder and shoved him out of the way. "Excuse me, officer," Monoma said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I would appreciate it if you would stop harassing my photographer. We're not quite done with him yet." The officer regarded Monoma with contempt. "This all you're doing?" he asked, jerking his head around the group of protesters who had grown suddenly quiet. Monoma took a step backwards and bowed exaggeratedly. He looked especially ridiculous with his pocket watch dangling from his pants and his face and hands splattered with red paint. One of his hands gripped a bucket of paint that hadn't yet been spilled. "I see that my reputation precedes me," he said. "Great," the officer said, snapping his holster shut and drawing out his baton. "You've just made my job a whole lot easier. Drop everything and put your hands in the air." The officer seemed to have forgotten Izuku completely. Izuku took advantage of this by slowly taking a series of steps backwards. "For you? Anything," Monoma replied coolly. "There's just one thing I need to do." Monoma moved his hand as if to grab his pocket watch, but instead he went for his bucket. Izuku saw it coming almost immediately. Monoma hoisted the bucket. Izuku raised his camera. Time slowed down. Monoma flung his bucket forwards, dousing the officer in paint. The photographs that Izuku took were arguably some of the best of his career. For your consideration, the officer's face contorted into a grimace. The rest of him caught mid-splatter, red paint coating his uniform and mere moments away from hitting his face. Monoma grinning devilishly, full of unapologetic intent. Izuku didn't dare move as the bucket clattered to the ground. Paint dripped from the officer's face as he fiercely wiped at his eyes with his sleeve. All hell broke loose. Whistles were blown. 2 officers came charging over. Izuku, watching everything unfold through his lens, gave them a wide berth. Monoma ran. One of the officers blew his whistle again. The protesters erupted. The crowd closed off Monoma's path of retreat from the officers with their bodies, blocking the cops from pursuit. People began to shout and swear, pointing accusing fingers at each other. The officers in riot gear pushed forward and started breaking people up. Someone threw a punch and received a faceful of mace. Izuku heard sirens, but he doubted the cars would be able to get through the blocked street. It had taken less than a minute for the protest to turn into a full-blown riot. It was nothing like a concert. It was impossible to know where to look, for one. Izuku tried to snap a photo in front of him, only to discover something else going on at his side. Fights were breaking out. People were getting sprayed. It was total pandemonium. If things go south, you better know how to handle yourself. Izuku needed to get out of the line of fire and move to the sidelines. He was going to end up getting punched or maced or worse. Izuku attempted to push through the crowd without much success. After a few attempts, a placard hit the side of his head. There wasn't much weight to it, but it was enough to turn his head in the direction of a possible path of escape. Izuku took a deep breath and, using one arm to protect his camera and the other to force his way through, he ducked low and took off through the crowd not unlike a football player. He lost his path a couple times and got knocked around a bit, but eventually Izuku made it to the outskirts. He sighed, placing a hand over his rapidly beating heart. Izuku raised his head just in time to see Monoma getting handcuffed between 2 cars. He snapped a picture. Monoma's head darted up. "Midoriya," he yelled, trying to raise his bound fists in salute. His wrists were promptly yanked back down by the officer. "No more spilled blood." Izuku nodded and raised a clenched fist to the sky. Monoma grinned. Izuku took another few photographs. Monoma continued to shout while 2 officers dragged him back towards the station. The protesters took note and parted before them. They began to chant, this time taking up Monoma's name. They raised their fists to the sky, waved their signs with fervor and stamped their feet wildly. Izuku could have sworn he felt the ground shake. This, he supposed, was what change looked like. "Nyato." A woman's voice cut through the crowd. Izuku spotted Kendo, furiously stomping after Monoma. "You goddamned idiot," she yelled. "Lucky number 13, Itsuka." Monoma called back. The crowd roared in approval. "I'm not bailing you out again." Kendo shouted. "That's okay." Monoma hollered as the station doors were opened. "Wait for me anyways." The officers dragged Monoma inside. The doors were barred once again. Just like that, Monoma was gone. Without their ringleader, the protest quickly lost steam. A number of arrests were made. People began to split, not wanting to be taken into custody. As the crowd thinned, Izuku realized it was time for him to go as well. He needed to submit his photographs as soon as possible. Izuku turned, fully prepared to leave, when the sound of breaking glass caught his attention. A trio had shattered the windows of a closed pawn shop not far from where Izuku stood. He recognized the Deadpool costume from earlier that day. Izuku suspected that they intended to take advantage of the chaos for their personal benefit. It was an easy decision, Izuku was already there. He adjusted his angle and snapped a couple of photographs. The smallest of them, a girl, turned. She looked young. She must have still been a teenager. A black surgical mask obscured the lower half of her face, but her cat-like eyes shone with amusement. "Oh," she said. She pointed a finger at Izuku, her blonde buns bouncing on either side of her head. "A friend. We made a new friend." She pivoted on her foot then skipped towards him. For some reason, the girl seemed familiar. The man in the Deadpool costume paused, a sizable television in his arms. The other male turned to look at Izuku. His appearance was unusual, but striking. His hair was jet black, and a series of intricate tattoos snaked along his neck and the lower half his face. His blue eyes were cold and calculating as he regarded Izuku. "I've got this," he murmured. The man lazily slung the baseball bat he was holding over his shoulder and began to stroll towards Izuku. Izuku took a few steps backwards, dread soaking through his innards. "Well, Mr. Photographer," the man drawled. "Trying to make a name for yourself at the expense of others, are you?" Izuku continued to back up. He put his hands in the air. "That's not it," he said, his mind racing. What could he say that would calm the man? He gestured towards the police station. "I'm with the protest. I'm on your side." "Oh my God!" The girl shrieked and pressed her hands against her cheeks. "He's so cute. A real cutie. I think I'm in love." Something about that girl seemed off, but Izuku had more pressing matters to attend to. "You're on our side," the man repeated. He tilted his head apathetically. "And whose side is that? You've just incriminated us, you know." The girl began to cackle. "He's so cutie," she wailed. She suddenly froze, her eyes crazed. "I want to see him covered in blood." "Wait. Blonde hair. Manic demeanor. Mentions of blood." Everything snapped into place. The girl that had broken into Katsuki's apartment. Izuku needed to get out of there. Izuku continued to back away, his hands still raised, while the two of them approached. "Look, I'm really sorry," he said. "I'll delete the photographs, it's no problem. If you'll just give me a moment." "But, you see, we don't know you," the man replied effortlessly. "Why should we believe a word you say?" Izuku grabbed his camera frantically. He prayed that someone had noticed the altercation. "I'll delete them," Izuku repeated. "Here, I'll even show you." "That won't be necessary. It won't happen again." "No," the man said, slowly dragging the baseball bat off his shoulder. "It won't." He swung the bat hard. Izuku shouted as he leapt backwards, just barely managing to dodge the first blow. The girl screeched in delight. Panic set in. Izuku turned to run, his camera swinging wildly around his neck. The second swing caught Izuku in the side. Izuku wheezed, pain exploding in his abdomen. He stumbled sideways, desperately trying to catch his breath. He turned to face his attacker, one hand in front of him and the other clutching his stomach. "Wait," he gasped, struggling to stay on his feet. The third swing came down hard from above. Izuku tried to duck. A dull thud resonated through Izuku's body. He didn't even have a chance to register the pain. From somewhere far away, Izuku saw the pavement rushing up at him. Then he saw nothing.